Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 135 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Dr. Lisa Damour for this episode, and I always love talking to Lisa. Her books and her podcast, which is called Ask Lisa, they're all incredible resources for parents. I urge you to check all of those out. I'm frequently recommending her book Untangled to parents of teen and tween girls. And she's got a brand new book out this week. It's called The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. So this one is not just for girls, but for parents of all kids. So we really had a great discussion. In addition to unpacking that whole tricky topic, the emotional lives of teenagers, we talked about trauma, which was actually a great follow-on to the discussion I had sometime last summer maybe, with Megan Reardon-Jarvis on the topic of trauma and grief. So you'll want to be sure to, go back and listen to that discussion, but also catch my discussion today with Lisa. And also we talked about why one of Lisa's first questions when she is encountering someone in crisis is to ask whether they're able to sleep, how sleep is going for them. And we talked about some options to consider if your teen is refusing to go to therapy, and so much more. So really a terrific discussion. Before we jump into my discussion with Lisa, I wanted to let you guys know some news from here. So first of all, a couple of in-person events coming up. If you're in the Seattle area, I would love to meet you at one of these. This weekend, February 26th, 2023, this coming Sunday, actually, I will be at the Safe Crossings Community Fair at Seattle Children's Hospital Sandpoint Learning Center from 2 to 5 in the afternoon. So Safe Crossings is a local grief support organization for kids and teens in King County. And they are having a community fair with all kinds of grief resources for families. Again, it's February 26th, and I will be there, and I would love to meet you. And then if that doesn't work for you, the following weekend, March 5th, which is also a Sunday, I will be at the new Barnes & Noble Crossroads in Bellevue, also from 2 to 5 p.m., and signing books and chatting with folks there. So come on by and say hi. That's March 5th at Crossroads Barnes & Noble in Bellevue. And one more thing, if you would like to read my first book, Future Widow, and if you don't happen to stop by Barnes & Noble to buy it, you also can request it from your local library. So if you are in Washington State, you can find it at your branch of the Seattle Public Library, the King County Library System, the Whatcom County Library System, or the Spokane County Library District. Future Widow is also in a whole bunch of other libraries across the country, from Boston to Dallas to Miami, lots of other cities, large and small, in between, and also actually in some other libraries as far away as Qatar and New Zealand, if you can believe it. If your library doesn't have it, you should be able to put in a request right on your library's website. If you have a library card, most libraries will let you sign in and request a book, and they will consider purchasing it for their collection, and then they will notify you. They'll put you as the first person holding the book for when it comes in and notify you when it's ready. So I encourage you to do that. All right, that's all the news from here. Let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Dr. Lisa Damour. Lisa is the New York Times bestselling author of Untangled and Under Pressure, and the author of the brand new book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. A graduate of Yale University, she earned a doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Michigan. She co-hosts the Ask Lisa podcast, maintains a private psychotherapy practice, and is a senior advisor to the Schubert Center for Child Studies at Case Western Reserve University. Lisa is joining us today from her home in Shaker Heights, Ohio. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, back, yeah, I should have actually said welcome back to the show, right? I mean, oh my goodness, I had to check, and it was February of 2019 that you were on the show, and Under Pressure had just come out.
That's right. And that was a
Yeah.
month before the pandemic.
Yes.
No, a month and a year. A month and a year. The
Yes,
hardback of Under Pressure had just come out. That's right.
Oh, yeah, right. So we were well pre-pandemic. This
Yep.
wasn't even on our radar screen. Under Pressure was terrific. And for listeners who haven't read it or seen it, well, I'm actually going to put a link in the show notes to our first discussion because we got into so much good stuff. Under Pressure is about stress and anxiety in teenage girls. And Untangled, the subtitle of which is Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood, which of course I don't need to tell you, but for the sake of listeners, this book is terrific. And so this is funny. I was talking to a colleague of mine last week and her daughter is like 6, first grade. And I said, okay, you don't need to read this quite yet, but put this on your radar screen. And in a few years, like I said, read it when she's in like 5th grade. And if you really want to get a jump on things, read it in 4th grade.
Yep.
And then read it again every so often, right? So I'm going to put a link to that, well, to all your books actually, but into the show notes because Untangled is amazing. So, and your new book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, which I have here, and listeners can't see me holding it up, but this is terrific. And the subtitle is Raising Connected, Capable, and Compassionate Adolescents. So I think we should just jump right in here. So in the intro, you start with an analogy. And since I am a former 20-year IT tech world person, I appreciated the analogy. You say for teenagers, powerful emotions are a feature, not a bug. Mm-hmm. You can tell us what you mean by that.
So it has always and everywhere been true that around adolescence, emotions become very, very intense for teenagers. And it's interesting to have weathered the pandemic as a clinician and trying to make sense of what the pandemic meant for our teenagers. My colleagues and I keep looking at each other saying, thank goodness we were practicing so long before the pandemic so that we actually had a baseline to measure what was happening and that we have long seasoning and memory that, as hard as the pandemic was, and it was very hard and for some kids, exquisitely difficult. Adolescence has always been hard and teenagers have always had big, intense feelings. And one of the things, and Jenny, I don't know if you have this experience of like, it's only when you get a little distance on something that you can get any clarity on it. I am finding that about the worst of the pandemic. And what I've been thinking about so much is how horrible it was for teenagers and how worried we rightly were as adults about their fragility in the context of the pandemic. And what I'm trying to sort through now is how we help parents feel less scared about their teenagers' powerful emotions. Because I think in the pandemic, they were really, they're scary under normal conditions. And then in the pandemic, they became very, very frightening or worrisome to adults. And here we are, most people living sort of a post-pandemic existence. And I think one of the things I really want to try to do as a psychologist in this space is to help people know this is actually typical to adolescence, what you're looking at, or this is not typical to adolescence, to help people make those distinctions, because I think everybody is so a little bit aftershock about going through that with their teenagers and really rightly concerned. Like, how do I know if something's really wrong? Because my kid is flipping out sometimes. Yeah. And I want to say, yeah, they flip out. Teenagers do that. That is the feature. That's not the bug. But it is really hard to know. And it was always hard to know. And now it's really hard to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And so this is reminding me, I'm going to dig deep into my memory here from our first discussion, because one of the things I asked you was like, how do you know if something is a normal teenage issue or a, I don't know, for lack of a better word, issue where you might need to intervene or seek professional support or whatever. And you had a useful yardstick about developing along the 7 different dimensional, developmental, I don't know, I'm not going to use the right word here. Can you tell us about your yardstick? Yeah.
So the way that Untangled was constructed is I lay out 7 developmental strands that teenagers should be advancing along.
That's the word I was looking for.
Yep, yes. That's okay. Or developmental lines. It really doesn't matter. And I will say, even though that book centers on girls, I have heard for years now, 80% applies to boys, and I am sure that is true. And of course, this new book is an all genders book. But one really handy definition of, to use very technical terminology, pathology in kids and adolescents, like when to worry, is if there's an interference with forward development. right? Because if there's anything kids are supposed to be doing, they're supposed to be growing. And they're supposed to be growing on multiple fronts, like socially, intellectually, the handling of their feelings, the management of their own, safety and self-care. And if something happens where they stall out or start to go in reverse on any one of those, that is grounds for concern. So that's the untangled definition. In this new book, I have a different definition. They can live side by side, but I think it really gets to where we started, which is I want parents to feel like they can tell the difference between feature and bug, right?
Yes.
And that's where it's so challenging. So the way this new book is constructed is I lay out how psychologists think about emotion, which is that we are vastly more at ease with negative emotions than it seems like everybody else is. We see them as typical, expectable, growth-giving, feedback-providing, occasionally problematic, but here anyway, so we need to figure out how they work in our lives. And what I really press on is it's not the presence or absence of distress, actually, that psychologists get attentive to. What we care about is how does it get managed? So is it getting managed in a way, and I'll give an example, does it get managed in a way that is working well, does no harm, or does it get managed in a way that does give relief but actually comes at a cost?
Wait, let me see if I heard you right.
Yep.
Okay, are they managing it? And if so, are they managing it in a way that is not doing harm, working well and not doing harm, or maybe working but doing harm?
Exactly. So
Gotcha. Okay.
So the book lays out, and I really, I hammer on this definition throughout. Mental health is not about feeling good. It's about having feelings that fit the moment and then managing them well. So an example. So picture, let's say, a 16-year-old boy who gets his heart broken, right? Person he likes doesn't like him back. Okay, this is going to be really, really painful. The presence of that pain does not alarm psychologists. In fact, it actually tells us he works just as he should, right? Though he is in pain, we expect to see pain when the person you like doesn't like you back. So we don't want to see it, but we're not sorry to see it, right? It is evidence for us that he's working well. Where we get interested in is, okay, well, what does he do about that pain? Does he listen to sad music and let himself cry to get some relief? Does he reach out to friends and have them offer him support? Does he find that if he goes for a run, it kind of helps him feel better for a little while? Or if he loses himself in a favorite old movie, he can take his mind off of it and get some relief.
Plays with the dog, maybe.
The dog, right? I mean, does things that he finds comforting, does things that, offer him a distraction, maybe a little bit, just to not have to think about it all the time. But does he sort of work his way through it? And I get much more detailed about what it means to work your way through it and all the ways to do it. But everything I just described, those are all really adaptive. They usually work for kids and they don't have a cost. Or does he decide that this is super painful, so I'm going to smoke weed until it dies down? Or I'm going to hop online and I'm going to trash the person who does not like me back? Or I am going to go start hitting on everyone else and having, cruel and brief interactions to sort of get this out of my system.
Right.
There's a whole lot of coping that we all do, or anyone can do, that is coping. I mean, it is an attempt to ease that pain, but it's pricey. And that is where we worry. So that's how I want people to know feature versus bug is it's not the presence or absence of distress. It's the costly coping that we really want to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Okay. So this is reminding me. So you said, and I made some notes here on the book, intense unwanted emotions are unpleasant, but they're part of life. And when they hit, psychologists are really only concerned with one question: how well are those feelings being managed?
That's what we want to know.
So that's what you're talking about here. Yeah. Okay. I love it. Okay.
But Jenny, actually, just to rest on that for a minute. Sorry, I'm so excited to talk about this book with
please,
you.
Yes.
The idea that intense unwanted emotions are a done deal and that parents don't actually need to be that worried about the presence of intense unwanted emotions, that is not where we are as a culture. I think previous to the pandemic, parents were pretty anxious when their kids had a powerful negative feeling. And I think subsequent to the pandemic, parents are extremely anxious when their kid has a powerful negative feeling.
Sure.
And so if I, had to give a second subtitle to this book, I think it would be something like, let's bring negative emotions back into the fold. They have a place in our kids' lives. We can't be fighting them or terrified of them all the time.
Well, and so this reminds me where you also say there seems to be an idea these days that mental health means feeling good.
Yep.
And this brings us back. Can you remind us then of your better definition?
It's not about feeling good, though we want people to feel good. I mean, psychologists are not against good feeling, but it's about having feelings that fit the context and then managing them well. So another example, picture a kid who is home alone and the parent has said to them, okay, before I get home, unload the dishwasher. That's all I want, right?
Right.
And picture the kid knowing the parent's coming home in 10 minutes and the kid is deep into video games and the dishwasher is totally untouched.
Yeah.
If that kid starts to get anxious, that's a good thing.
Right.
We want to see anxiety being like, dude, turn off the game, go unload the dishwasher. So yeah, he's got anxiety. And yes, it's actually probably quite unpleasant. Excellent. That is good evidence that this kid is working perfectly to become anxious under those conditions.
Which reminds me then of another point you make. Emotions, whether they're painful or pleasant, they're fundamentally informational.
Yeah, they are data, right? You go out to lunch with somebody and every time you spend time with that person, you walk away feeling kind of low or lousy or insulted. Stop going out to lunch with that person, right? That's what our feelings are telling us. Something's not working. Pay attention to that. Don't try to make the feeling go away or wonder, or I don't know. There's probably a lot of things that could happen, but that's data.
Yeah. Well, and in your example with the kid playing the video games in the dishwasher, it's information that they need to put down the controller and quickly get those dishes done. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And the feelings are helping them. Negative feelings are helping them do the things they need to do.
Gotcha. Okay. Which is also something, as I recall, you talked about in Under Pressure. A negative feeling might be warning a kid that they're going into a dangerous situation with, a party with people who are drinking and what's going to happen, things like that.
Absolutely. And I think, especially with examples like that, when we set ourselves as being against anxiety, against stress, or always treating it as it's a sign that something's wrong and we need to get rid of the feeling, it actually, in that example would keep kids less safe, right? If a kid shows up at a party and starts to feel super anxious because the party's out of control, what we'd like for them to do is leave the party. What we don't want them to do is think, oh my gosh, I'm anxious. Anxiety is bad. If I start drinking, I won't feel so anxious, right? That's not the outcome we're looking for. Anxiety in that situation is what we would call healthy anxiety. It is the right feeling, right time. It is alerting them to a threat. They need to manage it well.
Okay. As distinguished from, I don't know what you would call it, maybe clinical anxiety, where the perception of the threat isn't matching the reality of the threat.
Absolutely. So the distinction we make, you nailed it, right? So healthy fits the moment, telling us something we need to know. Unhealthy is if you're anxious when nothing's wrong, we don't want that. Or if your anxiety is way, way too big for what's wrong. So you have a quiz and you're having a panic attack. No one should have to have a panic attack over a quiz. So the only distinction, the only anxiety we consider problematic is if it makes no sense in its context or if it's way too big for what's happening. All other anxiety is your safety helper friend.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for going through that with us. So this book, the Emotional Lives of Teenagers, you've got it structured in some different ways. First, you talk about Adolescent Emotion 101. You've got, 3 big myths you want us to get past. Then you talk a bit about gender and emotion and how some of the conditioning comes into play there. You have a section talking about the seismic shifts in adolescence, including the puberty brain upgrades, which I want to come back to. And then managing emotions in 2 parts. So I think this is fascinating. And it's a really good landscape, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think helpful. In fact, I think in the last section, I don't have it in front of me, but one of the subsections is something like how to give advice to teenagers.
Yes. Yes.
I might be jumping right to that one, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, which is interesting. So 3 big myths. One of them being that difficult emotions are bad for teens. And we were just talking about that a little bit. There was one part of that, though. You go into kind of a caveat.
Yep.
I don't know if you call it a caveat, but a sort of a special case, maybe. And you talk about trauma.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of this difficult
Yeah.
emotions?
So for every myth I advance in the first chapter, I'm like, this is totally untrue, except for when it is true, right? So that myth that, emotions are harmful to teens, like intense negative emotions, I will say I have seen this too, Jenny, where parents are really scared. And I think it's just scared that if their kid becomes profoundly upset, it will actually do some sort of damage to their kid, like that experience. And I get it. Like I have teenagers, like I have seen the force of their emotions. And I can understand why parents might think like, this is dangerous for my child to be this upset. For the most part, it is absolutely not. And I lay out why. But there is a line that can be crossed where emotions do become harmful. They do. And we call that trauma. And that is actually what defines trauma, is that the emotional experience is overwhelming. It just blows the person out of the water. And what we know about trauma is that it leaves a mark. I mean, it can create lasting neurological shifts. And so we don't want to shield kids from distress. We actually want them to live their lives and learn and grow. We do want to shield kids from trauma. And I think about, the work you do and the reality that having a parent die can be a very traumatic thing. And it's probably more often traumatic than not. And that's something that, I think is important to say, which is not to say that means every kid or family is going to go on to have post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, like those are, you can be traumatized and really work your way through it and be, find your way. But it is to say, especially thinking about your work and your audience, trauma is an important topic.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad you're mentioning this. Because this was something I think I fundamentally didn't understand when I first started, learning about this years ago, thinking like, okay, I could understand if a kid has had their parent murdered in front of them or something like that. Inherently, I could just understand, okay, well, that seems like it could be traumatic, right? It's not a big leap to see that could be traumatic. But thinking about, a death of a parent by cancer, for example, or something where, it's coming for X amount of weeks or months or years, and then they die. And it's obviously going to be incredibly sad, but it didn't occur to me that might be traumatic. Right? It just because it's not an unusual occurrence. I mean, everybody's parents don't die, but it is, it happens frequently enough. And I had a very interesting discussion on the podcast a few months ago, maybe. I don't know if you know Megan Reardon Jarvis and her work. She does really good work around trauma and grief. And she's a psychotherapist. Yeah. And that was when it was blowing my mind, right? Like this idea that and actually you talk about this too. It's not the event itself that's traumatic or not traumatic. Tell us again what it is instead.
Okay, so this is super wonky, but also I think useful and important.
Yeah.
So when psychologists use the term trauma, we don't use it the same way everybody else does. Like, because people can use it very casually, and that's fine. Like, but in our business, trauma is the experience of having your coping blown out of the water. That's what trauma is. Okay. Having whatever you're up against outmatch your ability to cope with it, right? So it's a two-part thing, which is what's the event and who does it land on? And so, and we have known this for years and years. This is a sort of more distant example, which makes it easier to talk about. We have for years and years watched soldiers come back from war, and they will be the same people in the same brigade who went through the same situation, and 5 of them are traumatized and 10 of them aren't. And they all saw the same stuff, right? And they were all side by side. And so that helpfully opened up this, incredible line of work around, okay, well, what's the difference here? And, there's a lot of varieties. There can be genetic vulnerability. There can be past experience. There can be the amount of social support you had around you at the time it happened. So there are all these variables. I have like a super quick list in the book, but I think it is true, right? What you're saying, which is things that we wouldn't picture as traumatic, maybe because there's not some like big dramatic moment or, it's not violent or unexpected. I will tell you though, in my clinical work, I have cared for kids and teenagers who lost a parent, and the realization, the dawning realization of the permanence of that loss is something that was overwhelmed their coping, which isn't to say they haven't gone on to rich, full lives. And, like, I don't want people to think that then your kid's shattered and then there's nothing to be done. That's not at all the case.
Right.
But I've had kids talk about revisiting over and over and over again that moment when the realization dawned on them, and just really, dreaming about it, like all of the things that we see when somebody's trying to get mastery over something that was just too big.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, and so thank you for talking about this, because I think this is a really useful discussion. And I think it points to the idea that, it's worth considering. Could my child who's had their parent die potentially be having some trauma in this or not, or what? Or like, when do I need to think about more support or interventions? I get a little frustrated sometimes when I hear people, blow it off. Oh, kids are resilient. Yeah. They'll be fine. And it's like, maybe, right? Some of
we
them
can also help them be resilient. Right? We can help them be resilient by putting all the right stuff in place too.
Exactly right. Grief support is probably, in most cases, an excellent idea, whether or not they're, suffering, whatever you want to call excessively, or having more difficulty than you might expect. Grief support is probably always a decent idea to consider. And then there's that question, I think, and this is one of the things so these discussions are interesting, right? I'm trying to get my hands around, like, how do you figure out, or even start to think about, does my kid need more support here? And if so, what does that look like? Or how do I even start unpacking this question?
It's a really important and difficult one, especially in the context of the work you do, right? Yeah. Like when a kid has had to take in the reality of losing a parent. My general, so we can use the definitions I've got, right? That they will still work, right? Which is, their distress is, of course, a done deal. How they're handling their distress, we want to pay really close attention to. And does it come at a cost? Yep. Their development is critically important. Are they able to make and maintain friendships? Are they learning and growing in school? Are they increasingly taking good care of themselves? Are they, evolving in their ability to work with powerful emotions? Like, we want to see forward movement on all of those. If a kid gets stopped or goes backwards, we want to pay attention. So those definitions still actually work really well, even under extraordinary circumstances like the death of a parent.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, fascinating. Oh, so this then also is reminding me, in the book, you have an example, a high school senior named Jed, and it wasn't his parent who had died, it was one of his good friends. And his mom, Jed's mom, called you and said he had fallen apart, but he really didn't want to come to therapy. And eventually, somehow, he begrudgingly agreed to come in and meet with you. And this was the interesting part of that. After eventually he started opening up a little bit, telling you a little bit about what happened, your first question was, are you able to sleep? Can you tell us, so why start there? And if he says yes, or if he says no, like, then what?
So, I shared my sadness, or my empathy for what he had been through.
Yeah.
And I said, I got to ask you a question that will help us decide what the next step's going to be in our work together. And it was, are you sleeping? And this is something, it's funny to be a clinician. You kind of stumble on stuff in your clinical work. Like, you're always sort of feeling your way, especially when you're a young clinician. You're not sure what to do or what to ask. And I would say I struck on this. I don't know why I struck on this. Relatively early in my years. I mean, I've been practicing for nearly 30 years now, which is way better than being a new clinician, I will tell you. I was just talking about that with a colleague. We're like, oh man, we want to take back the first 10 years of work at least.
Yeah.
I asked this question, and here is why. Sleep is the glue that holds human beings together. We really can do nothing when we are sleep deprived. We are just, even without the death of a friend, or even without a difficulty, a person who is sleep deprived is going to be an emotional train wreck. Like, there's just no getting around it. And so I started asking, and that is the nature of work. You often see people, you meet them in a crisis. And so I started asking this question, like, tell me about your sleep, because it became very clear to me, if they were not sleeping, that was job number one.
Right.
And what's interesting, and I was talking about this with another clinical colleague, you then get really interesting information if you go down that road, because if they say, yes, I'm totally sleeping, then you can actually just work on helping them manage the crisis that brought them your way.
Mm-hmm.
If they say, no, I'm not sleeping, you then need to kind of think about like, okay, well, we need to get some sleep under your belt so we can actually start to do the work of helping you get through this. Some people, with that nudge, with the clinician saying, this has got to be the priority. I won't be able to, you won't feel better and I won't be able to help you until this is, in a better place. With that nudge, they'll make it happen. They're like, okay, didn't think it was that big a deal, but you're right. I'm going to put down my tech, or I'm going to stop drinking coffee at 4 or whatever. And they make it happen.
Right.
Other people can't make it happen.
Right.
And then all of the work goes to, what do we need to do to make this happen for you? Like, what's getting in the way of you sleeping? And it's interesting because I can imagine it feels a little basic, right? Or a little atheoretical, right? I mean, it's not deep, interesting, meaty clinical work. I gotta tell you, you're wasting your time trying to help someone who is barely managing because they are so tired.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this is such an important point. Sometimes I've been turning this over in my head too. Sometimes I think of the terminology like basic blocking and tackling, right? Like sleep, nutrition, hydration, right?
Yes.
Like no matter what's going on, if any of those are suffering, you're probably going to have problems that get in the way of tackling anything else.
Totally. And it's so interesting, Jenny, because I do think we feel like, really? We're just going to talk about the importance of sleeping and eating and staying hydrated? But I will tell you, 30 years into practice, man, that is my first question. Like, where are you with this? Because I want to help people get better fast.
Sure. Yeah.
And we can't get there if they are exhausted.
Right. And so I think this is useful for parents, right? If they're thinking about their kids and their family and wherever they're at right now, to be, sort of a mental checklist, like, is my kid sleeping? Okay. Maybe I need to call the pediatrician. Maybe I need to get to the sleep specialist if we've got bigger problems, whatever it is.
So let's actually put out some numbers here because people are surprised. So teenagers need 9 hours of sleep a night. Middle schoolers need 10, and elementary school students need 11 hours or more.
Wow.
So it's a lot more than people think. And that's, I think, a really important thing for us to know as parents.
And teenagers, you're talking high school students? What about what about college age? Is it more adult kind of stuff?
It's a good question. It probably starts to drop off a little, but then the range becomes much wider in terms of what people need. And most people continue to need between 7.5 and 9 hours of sleep. Like I'm an 8-hour girl. Like if I go below 8 hours, I will find myself quickly like the other night I slept 10 hours, which was really fortunate and set me back for the day. But my body was working to make up lost sleep. Yeah.
Sometimes I've noticed in myself that if I don't get enough sleep, I don't care about the things that I know I actually care about. Right. And it's just something about that brain just isn't quite, I don't know, that need for sleep maybe overrides everything else on some fundamental level.
If we could bottle what sleep does for human beings, it would be the most powerful drug on the market.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk a little bit about these puberty brain upgrades because, I have to tell you, like everybody knows, puberty, your body changes. I had no idea until I talked to you last time or read your book last time that this brain upgrade in puberty thing is a thing. It's a big deal. So tell us a little bit about that.
So puberty starts somewhere in the 10, 11, 12 range, which I think is also surprising to people. I think less surprising if you have a daughter because the modal age of onset for puberty is, so modal being most frequent age of onset for girls is around age 12. But by the time you can see it physically, it's been underway for a while. And I think that's in terms of the internal processes. So I think it's important. Stuff. Yeah, the brain stuff and shifts that we just can't observe.
Okay.
So I think it's important to understand that your 10, 11-year-old is, already probably into this, boy or girl, right? That's, a good chance. So what we know is that over the course of, especially when puberty begins, the brain starts to remodel. And it's like amazing. And this is actually why I love teenagers so much, because their brains are really, really shifting very, very quickly. And if you think about it, like talking to an 11-year-old versus talking to a 15-year-old, like those 4 years, like a huge amount happens in terms of the way they think and their ability to think.
Right.
And their brain is becoming more efficient, more powerful, works faster. And the order of events is that the remodeling happens in the order in which the brain developed initially, which is from the more, we call them primitive regions at the, above the neck in the back, up to the regions behind the forehead, which are the more sophisticated, more modern regions.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately for everybody, teenagers and their families, the emotion centers are in the back and they get upgraded and become very, very powerful before the perspective maintaining systems in the front get upgraded. So there's this period when I refer to in the book as like the gawky brain, right? Like where the emotion centers are like powerful and the ability to like put the brakes on is relatively weak. And what it means is when kids are not stirred up emotionally, their brains are not that gawky. I mean, that they operate quite beautifully. They can out-reason us sometimes. When they become emotional, those centers are just like, they just can overpower reasoning. And it looks like a meltdown. And it's really tough on the kid, and it's really tough on the person around the kid, because the kid does feel like they're falling apart, at least for a little while.
That's so interesting. And so thank you for telling us about that. This blew my mind last time we talked about it. So so that's cool. Another interesting thing that jumped out at me, actually, in here you talked about needing to help all of our teenagers develop a sturdy sense of self-worth. And that this is not like participation trophies and things like that. And actually, this I thought was super interesting. To protect self-worth in middle school, we should help our children have reliable sources of self-esteem in place by the late elementary grades. So what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? Why is this important?
Well, so one of the arguments I work out in this book actually has to do with the onset of sexual harassment around grades 6 or 7, which is much, much earlier than people think it. They think of it more attached to like sexualized activity, and they put it more towards high school. But when we look at the data, we see, and it's largely boys giving girls a hard time. We see it starting by 6th, then like fully in action by 7th. And I had this idea that I lay out in the book that I have to tell you, Jenny, the amount of time I spent checking to make sure that nobody else had ever said this before was extraordinary, because I thought there's no way nobody else has said this before. Like, I'm sure I can't be the first person to make this observation, but I actually struggled to find it. And there's like a ridiculously extensive note about this section in the back of the book. But one thing that is true of a 6th grade classroom is that the girls are beating the boys everywhere they turn. And it is because of a 2-year lead on puberty. So the modal age of onset for girls of puberty is 12. The modal age of onset for boys is 14. And what this means is that, and it really, like, you see it at its peak, the kind of gap between them, 6th grade going into 7th, there is the neurological advantage. So it makes them more emotional. It also actually makes them more powerful intellectually, that they can do abstraction. They can do things with their minds that they couldn't do when they were younger.
They seem smarter. They're doing better in school.
Absolutely. They already have better behavioral control, which they've had through grade school. And also, 6th and 7th grade girls are often taller, stronger, faster than 6th and 7th grade boys. So a boy I interviewed for the book said, there's nothing in the whole world worse than getting beat by a girl, right? That's his view. And these poor guys, they're getting crushed at recess, and then they come back to class and they're getting crushed in class. And of course, this is like broad strokes. There's kids all over the map.
Sure.
But I started to think, look at this. Here comes sexual harassment in the 6th grade. Here comes basically, it feels like crap to be a 6th grade boy a lot of the time. I'm starting to wonder if some boys handle this by trying to take the girls down a few pegs. Sexual harassment being a very powerful way to do it. And of course, conveniently or not, whatever, the girls are starting to have breasts. The girls are like, their bodies are developing. So, I mean, so I make this argument. And so it leads logically to like, we have to protect self-esteem, right? We have to protect self-esteem. We have to do it for the boys because there is going to be, for many boys, unless they happen to hit puberty early, and some boys do, there's going to be a juncture where it is really hard to be you because, and especially in this culture where they're suddenly getting often macho messages at 6 about what a real man does. Yeah. If you're getting beat coming and going by a girl, that is like a really tough spot to be in.
Right.
But we need you to have ways to feel good about yourself so that you don't decide to feel good about yourself by making girls feel small. And then for the girls, we also see, unfortunately, this huge drop in self-esteem right around the same time, often because of the sexual harassment. So it's sort of like everybody needs help around self-esteem.
Yeah.
And get it. Don't wait till 6th grade and this is starting to go off the rails to figure that out. So I would say by 4th or 5th grade, definitely get your kid doing things that they take pride in, that they feel good about, that they have a sense of mastery in. So it might be that they're a great athlete, but not every kid's going to have stuff like that works. So like, make sure they're doing service. Make sure they're helping out around the house. Make sure they have a hobby where they can actually start to develop a sense of mastery in that. And I have a long list of things to try, but I really like sexual harassment's bad for everybody.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've taken seriously enough what it feels like to be a 6th grade boy.
That's so interesting. Okay. And now I'm also thinking, let's say someone's parent dies around this time or becomes terminally ill and there's that crisis in progress, right? That seems like it could throw another wreak havoc into the whole situation.
100%. And I'll tell you my like kind of free association to that, the reaction I have to that. I'm sure you have come across this many times in your work. One of the things I'm always sort of, even though I expect it, I'm still staggered by it every time I see it, is how much shame families sometimes feel when someone dies, right? Even though there's no reason for shame. I have often uncovered a sense of like, somehow this reflects badly on us, or somehow we should have been able to prevent this, or somehow, and it doesn't get talked about that much because people don't talk about shame that much, but it's underneath. Right. And so especially if the dynamics in the family have a sense of like shame about it. And sometimes I think that where I've seen it clinically is where the parents are like, let's just not talk about this. Or like when there's a rush to shut it down, move past it. I think sometimes kids take that in like, this is shameful, or we have grounds for embarrassment or whatever, like whether that's what is meant at all, that is how kids can take it in.
Sure.
And so then I can think, oh my gosh, like picture you're a 6th grade boy and you're already vulnerable in all these ways. And then somehow, somewhere, somebody has made you to feel ashamed about what has happened in your family, right? That's not how we want it to be. But what's so beautiful is talking about it, right? Once we get it on the table, then we can actually do things to keep it from going down that road.
Which is another good argument for some of the grief support programs where you can be with other kids, same age peers who have also lost a parent.
Yep.
And kind of normalize some of that a little bit too.
Absolutely. And that we talk about it, and there's, people can talk about it and nobody has to get anxious that we're talking about it. I think is really important for kids. It's important for everybody.
This is so fascinating. We could keep talking about this all day long.
I love it. I love it.
All day long. I do have a couple other questions here. There's a chapter that's mostly about gender, including there's some discussion about non-traditional gender identities. But there's something you mentioned in there that I wonder if it might be useful more broadly. You talk about how your first job is to protect your child's mental and physical health. And your second job is to protect your working relationship with your teenager. And that was specifically in the context of talking about gender stuff. And but it seems, I wonder what you think. I mean, that seems like maybe a useful perspective for parents of teens overall.
It is. So that comes up in the context of thinking through kids who express a non-traditional gender identity. And obviously this is a book about emotion. So of course, I'm really going to center my thinking on like, what does this mean for them emotionally?
Sure.
And we do have data showing the kids who express a non-traditional gender identity are at higher risk for emotional challenges. Unsurprisingly, because our culture does not do very well with this and does not take a uniformly supportive or accepting stance. And so there are lots of ways that one can turn that question of what's the right way to respond when a kid expresses a non-traditional gender identity. And from where I sit as a clinician is the right way to respond is whatever it takes to protect that kid's mental health. That's the right way to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have data showing that families who affirm what a child shares about their gender identity, those kids have better mental health down the line. So those are the data. And I want parents to have those data. Like I want parents to know what we know from the research. So the way I think about it is almost like the sleep discussion. Like if you don't got sleep, you don't got nothing, right? If your kid is severely depressed or suicidal, it doesn't matter what else is going on. Like that has to be addressed. And here are the data on what we know about how to address that.
Right.
And I think that second to that, but a very close second is you got to have a good working relationship with this kid.
Mm-hmm.
So, because that's hugely powerful and important for kids, like beyond any amount that I think we really spend enough time celebrating. So that may mean you have to do some work on yourself, right? That's something that happens, I think, always in parenting teenagers is we want to keep our links with them. We want to keep our relationships with them. Having a good working relationship with someone in the home is, I would put it, in fact, we have data. I don't even have to say this as like my own opinion, like outmatches almost every other protective force in a kid's life, right? Having good working relationships with the adults in their immediate environment. Absolutely.
Okay.
And teenagers have opinions and teenagers
They do.
see it their way. And in order to maintain that good working relationship, we may have to make some adjustments as adults.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. Thank you. And there was another thing that jumped out at me that I wanted to ask about. Because I think this comes up a lot, especially for kids who've lost a parent and their other parents thinking they need help. They need to go to therapy. They won't go to therapy. They're refusing or not interested or whatever. And I thought this was kind of, well, I don't know if funny is the right word, but you say therapy is a pretty strange arrangement. Adults who seek out counseling are willing to accept the premise that it can be helpful to share intimate thoughts and feelings with a well-trained stranger. Teenagers, though, can find this to be a pretty odd idea and aren't always on board. And I thought,
it's true.
You hit the nail right on the head there, right? And you work with teenagers all the time, and I'm sure some of them are eager to come to you, and some of them are loathing the idea of walking through the door, and a lot of them are in between somewhere. But it is a strange arrangement, and one that I don't know that kids and teens intuitively grasp. Like, why should I talk to this person? Why should I tell them anything? You know, much less my most. Yeah. And so, and at some point you mentioned that sometimes it's actually more productive for you to meet with parents who've decided that they would like help rather than meeting with a teen who's decided that they don't actually want help or want to meet with you. I thought that was interesting.
So this is how I was trained, and it's worked well for me, which is I'll only see kids in therapy who want help from me. Because therapy is expensive and it's also time consuming. And so I really feel like I'm not taking your money and your time if your kid's going to sit there and like either, you know, say nothing or say words that are nothing. You know, I mean, that's not good. And more than that, I feel like the day may come where the kid really wants therapy. And if they feel like they got trapped when they didn't want it, they're not going to say they do want it when they do. Right.
Yeah.
So I will try to assess even in a phone call if it's the kid who wants the help or the parent who wants the help.
Okay.
Though I talk in Untangled, I think, about a kid where the parent said the kid wanted the help, but when I met the kid clearly did not want the help, you know, and that happens. And I will really try to make sure that the kid has an agenda of their own, that it makes sense to them, that we could work on together. And if they're not there, that's fine. I am so happy to meet with the parent or parents to figure out how the parent can best support them. Because like I said, that good working relationship at home, I mean, it really does outmatch pretty much everything else in terms of what we can do for kids. And it's sometimes nice because I've like laid eyes on their kid. Like I have a sense of who they're talking about.
Yeah.
And then it can happen that over time, the parent can help the kid want help. And then there can be another opening. But I don't keep kids in therapy who don't want to be there.
Well, so this is super interesting because from the parent's point of view, I think often it's easy for parents to feel like, oh my God, my kid needs help. You know, their parent died, their other parent died. They're clearly struggling with this or that or several things. But they're refusing to go. And so, what do I do? Do I make them go? Do I not make them go? Or do I have any other options? You know, and so I think, so from a practical point of view, let's say I had a kid who was refusing to go.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk to somebody, you know, like you're saying, to where somebody could help me help them.
Mm-hmm.
Do I talk to a therapist or psychologist who specializes in teenagers, or do I talk to an adult?
Great
how
question.
do I, yeah.
You're probably going to want to go to somebody who cares for kids and teenagers, who also provides parent guidance.
Gotcha.
And the reason for this is development is highly specific, right? How we talk with kids who are 6 versus how we talk with kids who are 10 versus how we talk with kids who are 14. That's what you learn in your training when you're learning to care for kids, is you really learn the kind of very specific, I kind of think it's like the developmental box the kid is in and the kind of language you speak in that box.
Mm.
And so you would want someone who has that knowledge base to help and to be able to guide you on how you can help at home and also how you can help your child get help if needed. And I will also say though, because I'm sure that happens all the time where the parent's like, you need to be in therapy. The kid's like, not happening, right? This is not happening.
Yeah.
The longer I've worked, the more elastic my definition of what's therapeutic has become. That I think sometimes kids have the most profound conversations with a coach or with a drama teacher or with a loving relative or, you know, that there are some really phenomenal adults who put themselves in the path of teenagers. And you can't always know you're going to find that person. You can't always know who that person is. But giving kids ways to feel safe and centered wherever they feel that is going to be good for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that's helpful. So thank you for talking about that, because I do hear that a lot, you know, kid refusing to go to therapy and what do I do? Okay. Well, like I said, I do think we could keep talking about this all day, but sadly we do need to wind up. So I have just one last question for you here. I like to ask all of my guests on the show if you could say one thing to widowed parents, and in this case, if you could say one thing to widowed parents of teenagers, what would you say to them?
I actually think I would say to them, and I hope this feels reassuring, the same thing I would say to any parent of a teenager, which is, by the time your child is, well, so we mark adolescence sort of really beginning around age 11. So by the time your child is 11 or 12, you should be ready for them to become very much a teenager. And by that time, you should be absolutely sure that you have sources of gratification and support that are not your kid. Because, you know, I have a 12-year-old right now, and she remains cuddly and sweet and like thinks I'm funny and wants to go to the grocery store with me. And like being with her is like wildly gratifying. I am on borrowed time and I know it. Like this is not, if all goes as it should, this is going to dry up pretty fast, and it won't dry up forever, and it'll change when it comes back. But one of the things I think is so hard for parents of teenagers is when that well dries up, if they don't have other ways to feel like they are valued in the world or supported in a relationship, it's really painful. And then I can only imagine somebody who is widowed, you know, where the world can feel impoverished of those kinds of relationships already, it being that much more true. So what I would say is make sure you have things that you do that you take great pride in, or people tell you you're very good at. because your teenager's not going to tell you that anymore. Right? Make sure you have people who can be like, you are really wonderful and you're doing great, even if your kid is rolling their eyes like it's their job, right? I mean, like you're going to need that as a parent of teenagers.
Yeah. Okay, well, terrific. I think that's actually a great place to end. So, my guest today is Dr. Lisa Damour, the author of the brand new book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. So, Lisa, where can listeners find you if they would like to learn more about your work? And your podcast too.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so let's start there. So I have a podcast called Ask Lisa, The Psychology of Parenting, where my wonderful co-host, Rena Ninan, and I take questions from parents. We get unbelievably fantastic questions from parents, and we just answer them week after week, every Tuesday. Best place to find everything I do is at my website, drlisadamour.com. So there you can find my podcast, my articles. I write quite frequently. Now I have 3 books that are available to parents. And I also really work hard to put good information out on Instagram. I have really come to feel that it's a valuable delivery device for just bite-sized parenting support. So I'm at lisa.damour, lisa.damour.
Okay, terrific. We'll put all those links in the show notes. And Lisa, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny. Really an honor to be back with you.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dr. Lisa Damour as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 135. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening. And until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.